Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 3. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock by Charles Dickens, Section 3. Chapter 2. Master Humphrey from his clockside in the chimney corner. My old companion tells me it is midnight. The fire glows brightly, crackling with a sharp and cheerful sound, as if it loved to burn. The merry cricket on the hearth, my constant visitor, this ruddy blaze, my clock, and I, seem to share the world among us, and to be the only things awake. The wind, high and boisterous but now, has died away, and hoarsely mutters in its sleep. I love all times and seasons each in its turn, and am apt, perhaps, to think the present one the best. But past or coming, I always love this peaceful time of night, when long buried thoughts, favoured by the gloom and silence, steal from their graves, and haunt the scenes of fated happiness and hope. The popular faith in ghosts has a remarkable affinity with the whole current of our thoughts at such an hour as this, and seems to be their necessary and natural consequence. For who can wonder that man should feel a vague belief in tales of disembodied spirits wandering through those places which they once dearly affected, when he himself, scarcely less separated from his old world than they, is for ever lingering upon past emotions and bygone times, and hovering, the ghost of his former self, about the places and people that warmed his heart of old? It is thus that at this quiet hour I haunt the house where I was born, the rooms I used to tread, the scenes of my infancy, my boyhood, and my youth. It is thus that I prowl around my buried treasure, though not of gold or silver, and mourn my loss. It is thus that I revisit the ashes of extinguished fires, and take my silent stand at old bedsides. If my spirit should ever glide back to this chamber when my body is mingled with the dust, it will but follow the course it often took in the old man's lifetime, and add but one more change to the subjects of its contemplation. In all my idle speculations, I am greatly assisted by various legends connected with my venerable house, which are current in the neighbourhood, and are so numerous that there is scarce a cupboard or corner that has not some dismal story of its own. When I first entertained thoughts of becoming its tenant, I was assured that it was haunted from roof to cellar, and I believe that the bad opinion in which my neighbours once held me had its rise in my not being torn to pieces, or at least distracted with terror, on the night I took possession; in either of which cases I should doubtless have arrived by a short cut at the very summit of popularity. But traditions and rumours all taken into account, whoso abets me in every fancy and chimes with my every thought as my dear deaf friend, and how often have I cause to bless the day that brought us two together! Of all days in the year, I rejoice to think that it should have been Christmas Day, with which from childhood we associate something friendly, hearty, and sincere. I had walked out to cheer myself with the happiness of others, and in little tokens of festivity and rejoicing, of which the streets and houses present so many upon that day, had lost some hours. Now I stopped to look at a merry party hurrying through the snow on foot to their place of meeting, and now turned back to see a whole coachful of children safely deposited at the welcome house. At one time I admired how carefully the working man carried the baby in its gaudy hat and feathers, and how his wife, trudging patiently on behind, forgot even her care of her gay clothes, in exchanging greeting with the child as it crowed and laughed over the father's shoulder. At another I pleased myself with some passing scene of gallantry or courtship, and was glad to believe that for a season half the world of poverty was gay. As the day closed in, I still rambled through the streets, feeling a companionship in the bright fires that cast their warm reflection on the windows as I passed, and losing all sense of my own loneliness in imagining the sociality and kind fellowship that everywhere prevailed. At length I happened to stop before a tavern, and encountering a bill of fare in the window, it all at once brought it into my head to wonder what kind of people dined alone in taverns upon Christmas Day. Solitary men are accustomed, I suppose, unconsciously to look upon solitude as their own peculiar property. I had sat alone in my room on many, many anniversaries of this great holiday, and had never regarded it but as one of universal assemblage and rejoicing. I had expected, and with an aching heart, a crowd of prisoners and beggars, but these were not the men for whom the tavern doors were open. Had they any customers, or was it a mere form? A form, no doubt. Trying to feel quite sure of this, I walked away, but before I had gone many paces I stopped and looked back. There was a provoking air of business in the lamp above the door which I could not overcome. I began to be afraid that there might be many customers, young men perhaps, struggling with the world, utter strangers in this great place, whose friends lived at a long distance off, and whose means were too slender to enable them to make the journey. The supposition gave rise to so many distressing little pictures, that in preference to carrying them home with me, I determined to encounter the realities. So I turned and walked in. I was at once glad and sorry to find that there was only one person in the dining room, glad to know that there were not more, and sorry that he should be there by himself. He did not look so old as I, but like me he was advanced in life, and his hair was nearly white. Though I made more noise in entering and seating myself than was quite necessary, with the view of attracting his attention and saluting him in the good old form of that time of year, he did not raise his head, but sat with it resting on his hand, musing over his half-finished meal. I called for something which would give me an excuse for remaining in the room. I had dined early, as my housekeeper was engaged at night to partake of some friend's good cheer, and sat where I could observe without intruding on him. After a time he looked up. He was aware that somebody had entered, but could see very little of me, as I sat in the shade and he in the light. He was sad and thoughtful, and I forbore to trouble him by speaking. Let me believe it was something better than curiosity which riveted my attention and impelled me strongly towards this gentleman. I never saw so patient and kind a face. He should have been surrounded by friends, and yet here he sat dejected and alone, when all men had their friends about them. As often as he roused himself from his reverie, he would fall into it again, and it was plain that whatever were the subject of his thoughts, they were of a melancholy kind, and would not be controlled. He was not used to solitude. I was sure of that, for I know by myself that if he had been, his manner would have been very different, and he would have taken some slight interest in the arrival of another. I could not fail to mark that he had no appetite, that he tried to eat in vain, that time after time the plate was pushed away, and he relapsed into his former posture. His mind was wandering among old Christmas days, I thought. Many of them sprung up together, not with a long gap between each, but in unbroken succession, like days of the week. It was a great change to find himself for the first time (I quite settled that it was the first) in an empty, silent room with no soul to care for. I could not help following him in imagination through crowds of pleasant faces, and then coming back to that dull place with its bough of mistletoe sickening in the gas, and sprigs of holly parched up already by a simoom of roast and boiled. The very waiter had gone home, and his representative, a poor lean hungry man, was keeping Christmas in his jacket. I grew still more interested in my friend. His dinner done, a decanter of wine was placed before him. It remained untouched for a long time, but at length with a quivering hand he filled a glass and raised it to his lips. some tender wish to which he had been accustomed to gave utterance on that day, or some beloved name that he had been used to pledge trembled upon them at the moment. He put it down very hastily, took it up once more, again put it down, pressed his hand upon his face, yes, and tears strolled down his cheeks, I am certain. Without pausing to consider whether I did right or wrong, I stepped across the room, and sitting down beside him, laid my hand gently on his arm. 'My friend,' I said, 'forgive me if I beseech you to take comfort and consolation from the lips of an old man. I will not preach to you what I have not practised. Indeed, whatever be your grief, be of a good heart. Be of a good heart, pray.' 'I see that you speak earnestly,' he replied, 'and kindly, I am very sure. But—' I nodded my head to show that I understood what he would say, for I had already gathered, from a certain fixed expression in his face, and from the attention with which he watched me while I spoke, that his sense of hearing was destroyed. 'There should be a freemasonry between us,' said I, pointing from himself to me to explain my meaning, 'if not in our grey hairs, at least in our misfortunes. You see that I am but a poor cripple. I never felt so happy under my affliction since the trying moment of my first becoming conscious of it, as when he took my hand in his with a smile that has lighted my path in life from that day, and we sat down side by side. This was the beginning of my friendship with the deaf gentleman, and when was ever the slight and easy service of a kind word in season repaid by such attachment and devotion as he has shown to me? He produced a little set of tables and a pencil to facilitate our conversation, on that our first acquaintance; and I well remember how awkward and constrained I was in writing down my share of the dialogue, and how easily he guessed my meaning before I had written half of what I had to say. He told me in a faltering voice that he had not been accustomed to be alone on that day, that it had always been a little festival with him, and seeing that I glanced at his dress in the expectation that he wore mourning, he added hastily that it was not that; if it had been, he thought he could have borne it better. From that time to the present we have never touched upon this theme. Upon every return of the same day we have been together, and although we make it our annual custom to drink to each other in hand after dinner, and to recall with affectionate garrulity every circumstance of our first meeting, we always avoid this one as if by mutual consent. Meantime we have gone on strengthening in our friendship and regard and forming an attachment which, I trust and believe, will only be interrupted by death, to be renewed in another existence. I scarcely know how we communicate as we do, but he has long since ceased to be deaf to me. He is frequently my companion in my walks, and even in crowded streets replies to my slightest look or gesture as though he could read my thoughts. From the vast number of objects which pass in rapid succession before our eyes, we frequently select the same for some particular notice or remark; and when one of these little coincidences occurs, I cannot describe the pleasure which animates my friend, or the beaming countenance he will preserve for half an hour afterwards at least. He is a great thinker from living so much within himself, and having a lively imagination, has a facility of conceiving and enlarging upon odd ideas, which renders him invaluable to our little body, and greatly astonishes our two friends. His powers in this respect are much assisted by a large pipe, which he assures us once belonged to a German student. Be this as it may, it has undoubtedly a very ancient and mysterious appearance, and is of such capacity that it takes 3 hours and a half to smoke it out. I have reason to believe that my barber, who is the chief authority of a knot of gossips, who congregate every evening at a small tobacconist's hard by, has related anecdotes of this pipe, and the grim figures that are carved upon its bowl, at which all the smokers in the neighbourhood have stood aghast; and I know that my housekeeper, when she holds it in high veneration, has a superstitious feeling connected with it which would render her exceedingly unwilling to be left alone in its company after dark. Whatever sorrow my dear friend has known, and whatever grief may linger in some secret corner of his heart, he is now a cheerful, placid, happy creature. Misfortune can never have fallen upon such a man but for some good purpose, and when I see its traces in his gentle nature and his earnest feeling, I am the less disposed to murmur at such trials as I may have undergone myself. With regard to the pipe, I have a theory of my own. I cannot help thinking that it is in some manner connected with the event that brought us together, for I remember that it was a long time before he even talked about it, and when he did, he grew reserved and melancholy, and that it was a long time yet before he brought it forth. I have no curiosity, however, upon this subject, for I know that it promotes his tranquillity and comfort, and I need no other inducement to regard it with my utmost favour. Such is the deaf gentleman. I can call up his figure now, clad in sober grey, and seated in the chimney corner. As he puffs out the smoke from his favourite pipe, he casts a look on me brimful of cordiality and friendship, and says all manner of kind and genial things in a cheerful smile. Then he raises his eyes to my clock, which is just about to strike, and glancing from it to me and back again, seems to divide his heart between us. For myself, it is not too much to say that I would gladly part with one of my poor limbs, could he but hear the old clock's voice. Of our two friends, the first has been all his life one of that easy, wayward, truant class, whom the world is accustomed to designate as nobody's enemies but their own. Bred to a profession for which he never qualified himself, and reared in the expectation of a fortune he has never inherited, he has undergone every vicissitude of which such an existence is capable. He and his younger brother, both orphans from their childhood, were educated by a wealthy relative, who taught them to expect an equal division of his property; but too indolent to court, and too honest to flatter, the elder gradually lost ground in the affections of a capricious old man, and the younger, who did not fail to improve his opportunity, now triumphs in the possession of enormous wealth. His triumph is to hoard it in solitary wretchedness, and probably to feel with the expenditure of every shilling a greater pang than the loss of his whole inheritance ever cost his brother. Jack Redburn. He was Jack Redburn at the first little school he went to, where every other child was mastered and surnamed, and he has been Jack Redburn all his life, or he would perhaps have been a richer man by this time. Has been an inmate of my house these 8 years past. He is my librarian, secretary, steward, and first minister, director of all my affairs, and inspector general of my household. He is something of a musician, something of an author, something of an actor, something of a painter, very much of a carpenter, and an extraordinary gardener, having had all his life a wonderful aptitude for learning everything that was of no use to him. He is remarkably fond of children, and is the best and kindest nurse in sickness that ever drew the breath of life. He has mixed with every grade of society, and known the utmost distress, but there never was a less selfish or more tender-hearted, a more enthusiastic, or a more guileless man; and I dare say, if few have done less good, fewer still have done less harm in the world than he. But what chance Nature forms such whimsical jumbles, I don't know; but I do know that she sends them among us very often, and that the king of the whole race is Jack Redburn. I should be puzzled to say how old he is. His health is none of the best, and he wears a quantity of iron grey hair which shades his face and gives it rather a worn appearance. But we consider him quite a young fellow notwithstanding, and if a youthful spirit surviving the roughest contact with the world confers upon its possessor any title to be considered young, then he is a mere child. The only interruptions to his careless cheerfulness are on a wet Sunday, when he is apt to be unusually religious and solemn, and sometimes of an evening when he has been blowing a very slow tune on the flute. Of these last named occasions he is apt to incline towards the mysterious or the terrible. As a specimen of his powers in this mood, I refer my readers to the extract from the clock case which follows his paper, He brought it to me not long ago at midnight, and informed me that the main incident has been suggested by a dream of the night before. His apartments are two cheerful rooms looking towards the garden, and one of his great delights is to arrange and rearrange the furniture in these chambers, and put it in every possible variety of position. During the whole time he has been here, I do not think he has slept for 2 nights running with the head of his bed in the same place, and every time he moves it is to be the last. My housekeeper was at first well nigh distracted by these frequent changes, but she has become quite reconciled to them by degrees, and has so fallen in with his humour that they often consult together with great gravity upon the next final alteration. Whatever his arrangements are, however, they are always a pattern of neatness, and every one of the manifold articles connected with his manifold occupations is to be found in its own particular place. Until within the last 2 or 3 years, he was subject to an occasional fit, which usually came upon him in very fine weather, under the influence of which he would dress himself with peculiar care, and going out under pretence of taking a walk, disappeared for several days together. At length, after the interval between each outbreak of the disorder had gradually grown larger and larger, it wholly disappeared, and now he seldom stirs abroad, except to stroll out a little way on a summer's evening. Whether he yet mistrusts his own company in this respect, and is therefore afraid to wear a coat, I know not; but we seldom see him in any other upper garment than an old spectral looking dressing gown, with very disproportionate pockets, full of a miscellaneous collection of odd matters, which he picks up wherever he can lay his hands upon them. Everything that is a favourite with our friend is a favourite with us, and thus it happens that the fourth among us is Mr. Owen Miles, a most worthy gentleman, who had treated Jack with great kindness before my deaf friend and I encountered him by an accident, to which I may refer on some future occasion. Mr. Miles was once a very rich merchant, but receiving a severe shock at the death of his wife, he retired from business and devoted himself to a quiet, unostentatious life. He is an excellent man, of thoroughly sterling character, not of quick apprehension, and not without some amusing prejudices, which I shall leave to their own development. He holds us all in profound veneration, but Jack Redburn he esteems as a kind of pleasant wonder that he may venture to approach familiarly. He believes not only that no man ever lived who could do so many things as Jack, but that no man ever lived who could do anything so well; and he never calls my attention to any of his ingenious proceedings, but he whispers in my ear, nudging me at the same time with his elbow, "If he had only made it his trade, sir, if he had only made it his trade." They are inseparable companions. One would almost suppose that although Mr. Miles never by any chance does anything in the way of assistance, Jack could do nothing without him. Whether he is reading, writing, painting, carpentering, gardening, flute playing, or what not, there is Mr. Miles beside him, buttoned up to the chin in his blue coat, and looking on with a face of incredulous delight, as though he could not credit the testimony of his own senses, and had a misgiving that no man could be so clever but in a dream. These are my friends. I have now introduced myself and them. The Clock Case. A confession found in a prison in the time of Charles the Second. I held a lieutenant's commission in His Majesty's army, and served abroad in the campaigns of 1677 and 1678. The treaty of Nijmegen being concluded, I returned home, and retiring from the service, withdrew to a small estate lying a few miles east of London, which I had recently acquired in right of my wife. This is the last night I have to live, and I will set down the naked truth without disguise. I was never a brave man, and had always been from my childhood of a secret, sullen, distrustful nature. I speak of myself as if I had passed from the world, for while I write this my grave is digging, and my name is written in the black book of death. Soon after my return to England, my only brother was seized with mortal illness. This circumstance gave me slight or no pain, for since we had been men we had associated but very little together. He was open-hearted and generous, handsomer than I, more accomplished, and generally beloved. Those who sought my acquaintance abroad or at home, because they were friends of his, seldom attached themselves to me long, and would usually say in our first conversation that they were surprised to find two brothers so unlike in their manners and appearance. It was my habit to lead them on to this avowal, for I knew what comparisons they must draw between us, and having a rankling envy in my heart, I sought to justify it to myself. We had married two sisters. This additional tie between us, as it may appear to some, only estranged us the more. His wife knew me well. I never struggled with any secret jealousy or gall when she was present, but that woman knew it as well as I did. I never raised my eyes at such times but I found hers fixed upon me. I never bent them on the ground or looked another way, but I felt that she overlooked me always. It was an inexpressible relief to me when we quarrelled, and a greater relief still when I heard abroad that she was dead. It seems to me now as if some strange and terrible foreshadowing of what has happened since must have hung over us then. I was afraid of her. She haunted me. Her fixed and steady look comes back upon me now, like the memory of a dark dream, and makes my blood run cold. She died shortly after giving birth to a child, a boy. When my brother knew that all hope of his own recovery was past, he called my wife to his bedside, and confided this orphan, a child of 4 years old, to her protection. He bequeathed to him all the property he had, and willed that, in case of his child's death, it should pass to my wife, as the only acknowledgment he could make her for her care and love. He exchanged a few brotherly words with me, deploring our long separation, and being exhausted, fell into a slumber from which he never awoke. We had no children, and as there had been a strong affection between the sisters, and my wife had almost supplied the place of a mother to this boy, she loved him as if he had been her own. The child was ardently attached to her, but he was his mother's image in face and spirit, and always mistrusted me. I can scarcely fix the date when the feeling first came upon me, but I soon began to be uneasy when this child was by. I never roused myself from some moody train of thought, but I marked him looking at me, not with mere childish wonder, but with something of the purpose and meaning that I had so often noted in his mother. It was no effort of my fancy, founded on close resemblance of feature and expression. I never could look the boy down. He feared me, but seemed by some instinct to despise me while he did so, and even when he drew back beneath my gaze, as he would when we were alone, to get nearer to the door, he would keep his bright eyes upon me still. Perhaps I hide the truth from myself, but I do not think that, when this began, I meditated to do him any wrong. I may have thought how serviceable his inheritance would be to us, and may have wished him dead, but I believe I had no thought of compassing his death. Neither did the idea come upon me at once, but by very slow degrees, presenting itself at first in dim shapes at a very great distance, as men may think of an earthquake or the last day, then drawing nearer and nearer, and losing something of its horror and improbability, then coming to be part and parcel, nay, nearly the whole sum and substance, of my daily thoughts, and resolving itself into a question of means and safety, not of doing or abstaining from the deed. While this was going on within me, I never could bear that the child should see me looking at him, and yet I was under a fascination which made it a kind of business with me to contemplate his slight and fragile figure, and think how easily it might be done. Sometimes I would steal upstairs and watch him as he slept, but usually I hovered in the garden near the window of the room in which he had learnt his little tasks, and there, as he sat upon a low seat beside my wife, I would peer at him for hours together from behind a tree, starting like the guilty wretch I was, at every rustling of a leaf, and still gliding back to look and start again. Hard by our cottage, but quite out of sight, and, if there were any wind astir, of hearing too, was a deep sheet of water. I spent days in shaping with my pocket knife a rough model of a boat, which I finished at last and dropped in the child's way. Then I withdrew to a secret place, which he must pass if he stole alone to swim this bauble, and lurked there for his coming. He came neither that day nor the next, though I waited from noon till nightfall. I was sure that I had him in my net, for I had heard him prattling of the toy, and knew that in his infant pleasure he kept it by his side in bed. I felt no weariness or fatigue, but waited patiently, and on the third day he passed me, running joyously along, with his silken hair streaming in the wind, and he singing, God have mercy upon me, singing a merry ballad, who could hardly lisp the words. I stole down after him, creeping under certain shrubs which grow in that place, and none but devils knew with what terror I, a strong, full grown man, tracked the footsteps of that baby as he approached the water's brink. I was close upon him, had sunk upon my knee and raised my hand to thrust him in, when he saw my shadow in the stream, and turned him round. His mother's ghost was looking from his eyes. The sun burst forth from behind a cloud. It shone in the bright sky, the glistening earth, the clear water, the sparkling drops of rain upon the leaves. There were eyes in everything. The whole great universe of light was there to see the murder done. I know not what he said. He came of bold and manly blood, and child as he was, he did not crouch or fawn upon me. I heard him cry that he would try to love me, not that he did, and then I saw him running back towards the house. The next I saw was my own sword naked in my hand, and he lying at my feet stark dead, dabbled here and there with blood, but otherwise no different from what I had seen him in his sleep. In the same attitude too, with his cheek resting upon his little hand. I took him in my arms and laid him, very gently now that he was dead, in a thicket. My wife was from home that day, and would not return until the next. Our bedroom window, the only sleeping room on that side of the house, was but a few feet from the ground, and I resolved to descend from it at night and bury him in the garden. I had no thought that I had failed in my design, no thought that the water would be dragged and nothing found, that the money must now lie waste, since I must encourage the idea that the child was lost or stolen. All my thoughts were bound up and knotted together in the one absorbing necessity of hiding what I had done. How I felt when they came to tell me that the child was missing, when I ordered scouts in all directions, when I gasped and trembled at every one's approach, no tongue can tell or mind of man conceive. I buried him that night. When I parted the boughs and looked into the dark thicket, there was a glowworm shining like the visible spirit of God upon the murdered child. I glanced down into his grave when I had placed him there, and still it gleamed upon his breast, an eye of fire, looking up to heaven in supplication to the stars that watched me at my work. I had to meet my wife and break the news, and give her hope that the child would soon be found. All this I did, with some appearance, I suppose, of being sincere, for I was the object of no suspicion. This done, I sat at the bedroom window all day long, and watched the spot where the dreadful secret lay. It was in a piece of ground which had been dug up to be newly turfed, and which I had chosen on that account as the traces of my spade were less likely to attract attention. The men who laid down the grass must have thought me mad. I called to them continually to expedite their work, ran out and worked beside them, trod down the earth with my feet, and hurried them with frantic eagerness. They had finished their task before night, and then I thought myself comparatively safe. I slept, not as men do who awake refreshed and cheerful, but I did sleep, passing from vague and shadowy dreams of being hunted down, to visions of the plot of grass, through which now a hand, and now a foot, and now the head itself was starting out. At this point I always woke and stole to the window, to make sure that it was not really so. That done, I crept to bed again, and thus I spent the night in fits and starts, getting up and lying down full 20 times, and dreaming the same dream over and over again, which was far worse than lying awake, for every dream had a whole night's suffering of its own. Once I thought the child was alive, and that I had never tried to kill him. To wake from that dream was the most dreadful agony of all. The next day I sat at the window again, never once taking my eyes from the place, which, although it was covered by the grass, was as plain to me, its shape, its size, its depth, its jagged sides, and all, as if it had been opened to the light of day. When a servant walked across it, I felt as if he must sink in. When he had passed, I looked to see that his feet had not worn the edges. If a bird lighted there, I was in terror lest by some tremendous interposition it should be instrumental in the discovery. A breath of air sighed across it; to me it whispered murder. There was not a sight or a sound, how ordinary, mean, or unimportant soever, but was fraught with fear; and in this state of ceaseless watching I spent 3 days. On the fourth there came to the gate one who had served with me abroad, accompanied by a brother officer of his whom I had never seen. I felt that I could not bear to be out of sight of the place. It was a summer evening, and I bade my people take a table and a flask of wine into the garden. Then I sat down with my chair upon the grave, and being assured that nobody could disturb it now without my knowledge, tried to drink and talk. They hoped that my wife was well, that she was not obliged to keep her chamber, that they had not frightened her away. What could I do but tell them with a faltering tongue about the child? The officer, whom I did not know, was a down looking man, and kept his eyes upon the ground while I was speaking. Even that terrified me. I could not divest myself of the idea that he saw something there which caused him to suspect the truth. I asked him hurriedly if he supposed that, and stopped. "That the child has been murdered?" said he, looking mildly at me. "Oh no! What could a man gain by murdering a poor child? I could have told them what a man gained by such a deed, no one better; but I held my peace, and shivered as with an ague." Mistaking my emotion, they were endeavouring to cheer me with the hope that the boy would certainly be found. Great cheer that was for me, when we heard a low, deep howl, and presently there sprung over the wall 2 great dogs, who, bounding into the garden, repeated the baying sound we had heard before. "Bloodhounds!" cried my visitors. What need to tell me that? I had never seen one of that kind in all my life, but I knew what they were and for what purpose they had come. I grasped the elbows of my chair, and neither spoke nor moved. "They are of the genuine breed," said the man whom I had known abroad, "and being out for an exercise have no doubt escaped from their keeper." Both he and his friend turned to look at the dogs, who with their noses to the ground moved restlessly about, running to and fro and up and down and across and round in circles, careering about like wild things, and all this time taking no notice of us, but ever and again repeating the yell we had heard already, then dropping their noses to the ground again and tracking earnestly here and there. They now began to snuff the earth more eagerly than they had done yet, and although they were still very restless, no longer beat about in such wide circuits, but kept near to one spot, and constantly diminished the distance between themselves and me. At last they came up close to the great chair on which I sat, and raising their frightful howl once more, tried to tear away the wooden rails that kept them from the ground beneath. I saw how I looked, and the faces of the 2 who were with me. "They scent some prey," said they, both together. "They scent no prey," cried I. "In Heaven's name move," said the one I knew, very earnestly, "or you will be torn to pieces." "Let them tear me from limb to limb, I'll never leave this place," cried I. "Are dogs to hurry men to shameful deaths? Hew them down, cut them in pieces." "There is some foul mystery here," said the officer whom I did not know, drawing his sword. "In King Charles's name, assist me to secure this man." They both set upon me, and forced me away, though I fought and bit and caught at them like a madman. After a struggle they got me quietly between them, and then, my God, I saw the angry dogs tearing at the earth, and throwing it up in the air like water. What more have I to tell? That I fell upon my knees, and with chattering teeth confessed the truth, and prayed to be forgiven. that I have since denied, and now confess to it again; that I have been tried for the crime, found guilty, and sentenced; that I have not the courage to anticipate my doom, or to bear up manfully against it; that I have no compassion, no consolation, no hope, no friend; that my wife has happily lost for the time those faculties which would enable her to know my misery or hers; that I am alone in this stone dungeon with my evil spirit, and that I die to morrow. Correspondence. Master Humphrey has been favoured with the following letter written on strongly scented paper, and sealed in light blue wax with their representation of two very plump doves interchanging beaks. It does not commence with any of the usual forms of address, but begins as is here set forth. Bath, Wednesday night. Heavens! Into what an indiscretion do I suffer myself to be betrayed! To address these faltering lines to a total stranger, and that stranger one of a conflicting sex, and yet I am precipitated into the abyss, and have no power of self-snatchation (forgive me if I coin that phrase) from the yawning gulf before me. Yes, I am writing to a man, but let me not think of that, for madness is in the thought. You will understand my feelings. Oh yes, I am sure you will, and you will respect them too, and not despise them. Will you? Let me be calm. That portrait, smiling as once he smiled on me; that cane, dangling as I have seen it dangle from his hand I know not how oft; those legs that have glided through my nightly dreams and never stopped to speak; the perfectly gentlemanly though false original. Can I be mistaken? Oh no, no. Let me be calmer yet. I would be calm as coffins. You have published a letter from one whose likeness is engraved, but whose name and wherefore is supposed. Shall I breathe that name? Is it? But why ask, when my heart tells me too truly that it is? I would not upbraid him with his treachery. I would not remind him of those times when he plighted the most eloquent of vows, and procured from me a small pecuniary accommodation; and yet I would see him did I say? Him! Alas, such is woman's nature! For as the poet beautifully says, but you will already have anticipated the sentiment. Is it not sweet? Oh yes. It was in this city, hallowed by the recollection, that I met him first; and assuredly if mortal happiness be recorded anywhere, then those rubbers with their 3 and 6 points are scored on tablets of celestial brass. He always held an honour, generally too, on that eventful night we stood at 8. He raised his eyes, luminous in their seductive sweetness, to my agitated face. 'Can you?' said he, with peculiar meaning. I felt the gentle pressure of his foot on mine. Our corns throbbed in unison. 'Can you?' he said again, and every lineament of his expressive countenance added the words, 'resist me?' I murmured 'No,' and fainted. They said that when I recovered it was the weather. I said it was the nutmeg in the negus. How little did they suspect the truth! How little did they guess the deep mysterious meaning of that inquiry! He called next morning on his knees. I do not mean to say that he actually came in that position to the house door, but that he went down upon those joints directly the servant had retired. He brought some verses in his hat, which he said were original, but which I have found since were Milton's; likewise a little bottle labelled laudanum, and a pistol, and a sword stick. He drew the latter, uncorked the former, and clicked the trigger of the pocket firearm. He had come, he said, to conquer or to die. He did not die. He wrested from me an avowal of my love, and let off the pistol out of a back window previous to partaking of a slight repast. Faithless, inconstant man! How many ages seemed to have elapsed since his unaccountable and perfidious disappearance! Could I still forgive him both that and the borrowed lucre that he promised to pay next week? Could I spurn him from my feet if he approached in penitence, and with a matrimonial object? Would the blandishing enchanter still weave his spells around me, or shall I burst them all, and turn away in coldness? I dare not trust my weakness with the thought. My brain is in a whirl again. You know his address, his occupations, his mode of life; are acquainted, perhaps, with his inmost thoughts. You are a humane and philanthropic character. Reveal all you know all, but especially the street and number of his lodgings. The post is departing, the bellman rings. Pray Heaven it be not the knell of love and hope to Belinda. P.S. Pardon the wanderings of a bad pen and a distracted mind. Addressed to the Post Office. The bellman, rendered impatient by delay, is ringing dreadfully in the passage. P.P.S. I open this to say that the bellman is gone, and that you must not expect it till the next post, and don't be surprised when you don't get it. Master Humphrey does not feel himself at liberty to furnish his fair correspondent with the address of the gentleman in question, but he publishes her letter as a public appeal to his faith and gallantry. Section 3. Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 4. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock by Charles Dickens, Section 4. Chapter 3, Part 1. Master Humphrey's Visitor. When I am in a thoughtful mood, I often succeed in diverting the current of some mournful reflections, by conjuring up a number of fanciful associations with the objects that surround me, and dwelling upon the scenes and characters they suggest. I have been led by this habit to assign to every room in my house and every old staring portrait on its walls a separate interest of its own. Thus I am persuaded that a stately dame, terrible to behold in her rigid modesty, who hangs above the chimney piece of my bedroom, is the former lady of the mansion. In the courtyard below is a stone face of surpassing ugliness, which I have somehow (in a kind of jealousy, I am afraid) associated with her husband. Above my study is a little room with ivy peeping through the lattice, from which I bring their daughter, a lovely girl of 18 or 19 years of age, and dutiful in all respects save one, that one being her devoted attachment to a young gentleman on the stairs, whose grandmother, degraded to a disused laundry in the garden, piques herself upon an old family quarrel, and is the implacable enemy of their love. With such materials as these I work out many a little drama, whose chief merit is, that I can bring it to a happy end at will. I have so many of them on hand, that if on my return home one of these evenings I were to find some bluff old wight of 2 centuries ago comfortably seated in my easy chair, and a lovelorn damsel vainly appealing to his heart, and leaning her white arm upon my clock itself, I verily believe I should only express my surprise that they had kept me waiting so long, and never honoured me with a call before. I was in such a mood as this, sitting in my garden yesterday morning, under the shade of a favourite tree, revelling in all the bloom and brightness about me, and feeling every sense of hope and enjoyment quickened by this most beautiful season of spring, when my meditations were interrupted by the unexpected appearance of my barber at the end of the walk, who I immediately saw was coming towards me with a hasty step that betokened something remarkable. My barber is at all times a very brisk, bustling, active little man, for he is, as it were, chubby all over, without being stout or unwieldy, but yesterday his alacrity was so very uncommon that it quite took me by surprise. For could I fail to observe when he came up to me that his grey eyes were twinkling in a most extraordinary manner, that his little red nose was in an unusual glow, that every line in his round bright face was twisted and curved into an expression of pleased surprise, and that his whole countenance was radiant with glee? I was still more surprised to see my housekeeper, who usually preserves a very staid air, and stands somewhat upon her dignity, peeping round the hedge at the bottom of the walk, and exchanging nods and smiles with the barber, who twice or thrice looked over his shoulder for that purpose. I could conceive no announcement to which these appearances could be the prelude, unless it were that they had married each other that morning. I was, consequently, a little disappointed when it only came out that there was a gentleman in the house who wished to speak with me. 'And who is it?' said I. The barber, with his face screwed up still tighter than before, replied that the gentleman would not send his name, but wished to see me. I pondered for a moment, wondering who this visitor might be, and I remarked that he embraced the opportunity of exchanging another nod with the housekeeper, who still lingered in the distance. 'Well,' said I, 'bid the gentleman come here.' This seemed to be the consummation of the barber's hopes, for he turned sharp round and actually ran away. Now, my sight is not very good at a distance, and therefore when the gentleman first appeared in the walk, I was not quite clear whether he was a stranger to me or otherwise. He was an elderly gentleman, but came tripping along in the pleasantest manner conceivable, avoiding the garden roller and the borders of the beds with inimitable dexterity, picking his way among the flower pots, and smiling with unspeakable good humour. Before he was half way up the walk he began to salute me, then I thought I knew him. But when he came towards me with his hat in his hand, the sun shining on his bald head, his bland face, his bright spectacles, his fawn coloured tights, and his black gaiters, then my heart warmed towards him, and I felt quite certain that it was Mr. Pickwick. 'My dear sir,' said that gentleman as I rose to receive him, 'pray be seated. Pray sit down. Now, do not stand on my account. I must insist upon it, really.' With these words, Mr. Pickwick gently pressed me down into my seat, and taking my hand in his, shook it again and again with a warmth of manner perfectly irresistible. I endeavoured to express in my welcome something of that heartiness and pleasure which the sight of him awakened, and made him sit down beside me. All this time he kept alternately releasing my hand and grasping it again, and surveying me through his spectacles with such a beaming countenance as I never till then beheld. 'You knew me directly,' said Mr. Pickwick. 'What a pleasure it is to think that you knew me directly.' I remarked that I had read his adventures very often, and his features were quite familiar to me from the published portraits. As I thought it a good opportunity of adverting to the circumstance, I condoled with him upon the various libels on his character which had found their way into print. Mr. Pickwick shook his head, and for a moment looked very indignant, but smiling again directly, added that no doubt I was acquainted with Cervantes' introduction to the second part of Don Quixote, and that it fully expressed his sentiments on the subject. 'But now,' said Mr. Pickwick, 'don't you wonder how I found you out?' 'I shall never wonder, and with your good leave never know,' said I, smiling in my turn. 'It is enough for me that you give me this gratification. I have not the least desire that you should tell me by what means I have obtained it.' 'You are very kind,' returned Mr. Pickwick, shaking me by the hand again. 'You are so exactly what I expected. But for what particular purpose do you think I have sought you out, my dear sir? Now, what do you think I have come for?' Mr. Pickwick put this question as though he were persuaded that it was morally impossible that I could by any means divine the deep purpose of his visit, and that it must be hidden from all human ken. Therefore, although I was rejoiced to think that I had anticipated his drift, I feigned to be quite ignorant of it, and after a brief consideration shook my head despairingly. 'What should you say,' said Mr. Pickwick, laying the forefinger of his left hand upon my coat sleeve, and looking at me with his head thrown back, and a little on one side, 'what should you say if I confessed that after reading your account of yourself and your little society, I had come here a humble candidate for one of those empty chairs?' 'I should say,' I returned, 'that I know of only one circumstance which could still further endear that little society to me, and that would be the associating with it my old friend, for you must let me call you so, my old friend Mr. Pickwick.' As I made him this answer, every feature of Mr. Pickwick's face fused itself into one all pervading expression of delight. After shaking me heartily by both hands at once, he patted me gently on the back, and then—I well understand why—coloured up to the eyes, and hoped with great earnestness of manner that he had not hurt me. If he had, I would have been content that he should have repeated the offence 100 times rather than suppose so; but as he had not, I had no difficulty in changing the subject by making an inquiry which had been upon my lips 20 times already. 'You have not told me,' said I, 'anything about Sam Weller.' 'Oh, Sam,' replied Mr. Pickwick, 'is the same as ever. The same true, faithful friend that he ever was. What should I tell you about Sam, my dear sir, except that he is more indispensable to my happiness and comfort every day of my life?' 'And Mr. Weller, senior?' said I. 'Old Mr. Weller,' returned Mr. Pickwick, 'is in no respect more altered than Sam, unless it be that he is a little more opinionated than he was formerly, and perhaps at times more talkative. He spends a good deal of his time now in our neighbourhood, and has so constituted himself a part of my bodyguard, that when I ask permission for Sam to have a seat in your kitchen on clock nights, supposing your three friends think me worthy to fill one of the chairs, I am afraid I must often include Mr. Weller too.' I very readily pledged myself to give both Sam and his father a free admission to my house at all hours and seasons, and this point settled, we fell into a lengthy conversation which was carried on with as little reserve on both sides as if we had been intimate friends from our youth, and which conveyed to me the comfortable assurance that Mr. Pickwick's buoyancy of spirit, and indeed all his old cheerful characteristics, were wholly unimpaired. As he had spoken of the consent of my friends as being yet in abeyance, I repeatedly assured him that his proposal was certain to receive their most joyful sanction, and several times entreated that he would give me leave to introduce him to Jack Redburn and Mr. Miles, who were near at hand, without further ceremony. To this proposal, however, Mr. Pickwick's delicacy would by no means allow him to accede, for he urged that his eligibility must be formally discussed, and that until this had been done, he could not think of obtruding himself further. The utmost I could obtain from him was a promise that he would attend upon our next night of meeting, that I might have the pleasure of presenting him immediately on his election. Mr. Pickwick, having with many blushes placed in my hands a small roll of paper, which he termed his qualifications, put a great many questions to me touching my friends, and particularly Jack Redburn, whom he repeatedly termed a fine fellow, and in whose favour I could see he was strongly predisposed. When I had satisfied him on these points, I took him up into my room, that he might make acquaintance with the old chamber which is our place of meeting. 'And this,' said Mr. Pickwick, stopping short, 'is the clock. Dear me! And this is really the old clock!' I thought he would never have come away from it. After advancing towards it softly, and laying his hand upon it with as much respect and as many smiling looks as if it were alive, he set himself to consider it in every possible direction, now mounting on a chair to look at the top, now going down upon his knees to examine the bottom, now surveying the sides with his spectacles almost touching the case, and now trying to peep between it and the wall to get a slight view of the back. Then he would retire a pace or two, and look up at the dial to see it go, and then draw near again and stand with his head on one side to hear it tick, never failing to glance towards me at intervals of a few seconds each, and nod his head with such complacent gratification as I am quite unable to describe. His admiration was not confined to the clock either, but extended itself to every article in the room, and really when he had gone through them every one, and at last sat himself down in all the 6 chairs, one after another, to try how they felt, I never saw such a picture of good humour and happiness as he presented, from the top of his shining head down to the very last button of his gaiters. I should have been well pleased, and should have had the utmost enjoyment of his company, if he had remained with me all day, but my favourite, striking the hour, reminded him that he must take his leave. I could not forbear telling him once more how glad he had made me, and we shook hands all the way downstairs. We had no sooner arrived in the hall than my housekeeper, gliding out of her little room (she had changed her gown and cap, I observed), greeted Mr. Pickwick with her best smile and courtesy, and the barber, feigning to be accidentally passing on his way out, made him a vast number of bows. When the housekeeper courtesied, Mr. Pickwick bowed with the utmost politeness, and when he bowed the housekeeper courtesied again, between the housekeeper and the barber. I should say that Mr. Pickwick faced about and bowed with undiminished affability 50 times at least. I saw him to the door. An omnibus was at that moment passing the corner of the lane, which Mr. Pickwick hailed, and ran after with extraordinary nimbleness. When he had got about half way, he turned his head, and seeing that I was still looking after him, and that I waved my hand, stopped, evidently irresolute whether to come back and shake hands again, or to go on. The man behind the omnibus shouted, and Mr. Pickwick ran a little way towards him, then he looked round at me, and ran a little way back again. Then there was another shout, and he turned round once more and ran the other way. After several of these vibrations, the man settled the question by taking Mr. Pickwick by the arm and putting him into the carriage, but his last action was to let down the window and wave his hat to me as it drove off. I lost no time in opening the parcel he had left with me. The following were its contents: Mr. Pickwick's Tale. A good many years have passed away since old John Podgers lived in the town of Windsor, where he was born, and where in the course of time he came to be comfortably and snugly buried. You may be sure that in the time of King James the First, Windsor was a very quaint, queer old town, and you may take it upon my authority that John Podgers was a very quaint, queer old fellow. Consequently, he and Windsor fitted each other to a nicety, and seldom parted company even for half a day. John Podgers was broad, sturdy, Dutch built, short, and a very hard eater, as men of his figure often are. Being a hard sleeper likewise, he divided his time pretty equally between these two recreations, always falling asleep when he had done eating, and always taking another turn at the trencher when he had done sleeping, by which means he grew more corpulent and more drowsy every day of his life. Indeed, it used to be currently reported that when he sauntered up and down the sunny side of the street before dinner, as he never failed to do in fair weather, he enjoyed his soundest nap. But many people held this to be a fiction, as he had several times been seen to look after fat oxen on market days, and had even been heard, by persons of good credit and reputation, to chuckle at the sight, and say to himself with great glee, "Live beef! Live beef!" It was upon this evidence that the wisest people in Windsor, beginning with the local authorities of course, held that John Podgers was a man of strong sound sense, not what is called smart perhaps, and it might be of a rather lazy and apoplectic turn, but still a man of solid parts, and one who meant much more than he cared to show. This impression was confirmed by a very dignified way he had of shaking his head and imparting at the same time a pendulous motion to his double chin. In short, he passed for one of those people who, being plunged into the Thames, would make no vain efforts to set it afire, but would straightway flop down to the bottom with a deal of gravity, and be highly respected in consequence by all good men. Being well to do in the world, and a peaceful widower, having a great appetite which, as he could afford to gratify it, was a luxury and no inconvenience, and a power of going to sleep, which, as he had no occasion to keep awake, was a most enviable faculty, you will readily suppose that John Podgers was a happy man. But appearances are often deceptive when they least seem so, and the truth is, that, notwithstanding his extreme sleekness, he was rendered uneasy in his mind and exceedingly uncomfortable by a constant apprehension that beset him night and day. You know very well that in those times there flourished divers evil old women who, under the name of witches, spread great disorder through the land, and inflicted various dismal tortures upon Christian men, sticking pins and needles into them when they least expected it, and causing them to walk in the air with their feet upwards, to the great terror of their wives and families, who were naturally very much disconcerted when the master of the house unexpectedly came home, knocking at the door with his heels, and combing his hair on the scraper. These were their commonest pranks, but they every day played 100 others, of which none was less objectionable, and many were much more so, being improper besides. The result was that vengeance was denounced against all old women, with whom even the king himself had no sympathy, as he certainly ought to have had, For with his own most gracious hand he penned a most gracious consignment of them to everlasting wrath, and devised most gracious means for their confusion and slaughter, in virtue whereof scarcely a day passed but one which at the least was most graciously hanged, drowned, or roasted in some part of his dominions. Still the press teemed with strange and terrible news from the north, or the south, or the east, or the west, relative to witches and their unhappy victims in some corner of the country, and the public's hair stood on end to that degree that it lifted its hat off its head and made its face pale with terror. You may believe that the little town of Windsor did not escape the general contagion. The inhabitants boiled a witch on the King's birthday, and sent a bottle of the broth to Court, with a dutiful address expressive of their loyalty. The King, being rather frightened by the present, piously bestowed it upon the Archbishop of Canterbury, and returned an answer to the address, wherein he gave them golden rules for discovering witches, and laid great stress upon certain protecting charms, and especially horseshoes. Immediately the townspeople went to work nailing up horseshoes over every door, and so many anxious parents apprenticed their children to farriers to keep them out of harm's way, that it became quite a genteel trade, and flourished exceedingly. In the midst of all this bustle, John Podgers ate and slept as usual, but shook his head a great deal oftener than was his custom, and was observed to look at the oxen less and at the old women more. He had a little shelf put up in his sitting room, whereon was displayed, in a row which grew longer every week, all the witchcraft literature of the time. He grew learned in charms and exorcisms, hinted at certain questionable females on broomsticks whom he had seen from his chamber window riding in the air at night, and was in constant terror of being bewitched. At length, from perpetually dwelling upon this one idea, which being alone in his head had all its own way, the fear of witches became the single passion of his life. He, who up to that time had never known what it was to dream, began to have visions of witches whenever he fell asleep. Waking, they were incessantly present to his imagination likewise, and sleeping or waking he had not a moment's peace. He began to set witch traps in the highway, and was often seen lying in wait round the corner for hours together to watch their effect. These engines were of simple construction, usually consisting of two straws disposed in the form of a cross, or a piece of a Bible cover with a pinch of salt upon it, but they were infallible, and if an old woman chanced to stumble over them, as not unfrequently happened, the chosen spot being a broken and stony place, John started from a doze, pounced out upon her, and hung round her neck till assistance arrived, when she was immediately carried away and drowned. By dint of constantly inveigling old ladies and disposing of them in this summary manner, he acquired the reputation of a great public character, and as he received no harm in these pursuits beyond a scratched face or so, he came in the course of time to be considered witch-proof. There was but one person who entertained the least doubt of John Podgers's gifts, and that person was his own nephew, a wild roving young fellow of 20, who had been brought up in his uncle's house and lived there still, that is to say when he was at home, which was not as often as it might have been. As he was an apt scholar, it was he who read aloud every fresh piece of strange and terrible intelligence that John Podgers bought, and this he always did of an evening in the little porch in front of the house, round which the neighbours would flock in crowds to hear the direful news, for people like to be frightened, and when they can be frightened for nothing at another man's expense, they like it all the better. One fine midsummer evening, a group of persons were gathered in this place, listening intently to Will Marks (that was the nephew's name), as with his cap very much on one side, his arm coiled slyly round the waist of a pretty girl who sat beside him, and his face screwed into a comical expression intended to represent extreme gravity, he read, with Heaven knows how much embellishments of his own, a dismal account of a gentleman down in Northamptonshire under the influence of witchcraft and taken forcible possession of by the devil, who was playing his very self with him. John Podgers, in a high sugar-loaf hat and short cloak, filled the opposite seat, and surveyed the auditory with a look of mingled pride and horror very edifying to see, while the hearers, with their heads thrust forward and their mouths open, listened and trembled, and hoped there was a great deal more to come. Sometimes Will stopped for an instant to look round upon his eager audience, and then, with a more comical expression of face than before, and a settling of himself comfortably, which included a squeeze of the young lady before mentioned, he launched into some new wonder surpassing all the others. The setting sun shed his last golden rays upon this little party, who, absorbed in their present occupation, took no heed of the approach of night, or the glory in which the day went down, when the sound of a horse approaching at a good round trot invaded the silence of the hour, caused the reader to make a sudden stop, and the listeners to raise their heads in wonder. Nor was their wonder diminished when a horseman dashed up to the porch, and abruptly checking his steed, inquired where one John Podgers dwelt. "Here!" cried a dozen voices, while a dozen hands pointed out sturdy John, still basking in the terrors of the pamphlet. The rider, giving his bridle to one of those who surrounded him, dismounted, and approached John, hat in hand, but with great haste. "Whence come ye?" asked John. "From Kingston, master." "And wherefore?" "On most pressing business." "Of what nature?" "Witchcraft." Witchcraft. Everybody looked aghast at the breathless messenger, and the breathless messenger looked equally aghast at everybody, except Will Marks, who, finding himself unobserved, not only squeezed the young lady again, but kissed her twice. Surely he must have been bewitching himself, or he never could have done it; and the young lady too, or she never would have let him. "Witchcraft!" cried Will, drowning the sound of his last kiss, which was rather a loud one. The messenger turned towards him, and, with a frown, repeated the word more solemnly than before, and then told his errand, which was, in brief, that the people of Kingston had been greatly terrified for some nights past by hideous revels, held by witches beneath the gibbet within a mile of the town, and related and deposed to by chance wayfarers who had passed within earshot of the spot; that the sound of their voices in their wild orgies had been plainly heard by many persons; that 3 old women laboured under strong suspicion, and that precedents had been consulted and solemn counsel had, and it was found that to identify the hag some single person must watch upon the spot alone; that no single person had the courage to perform the task, and that he had been dispatched express to solicit John Podgers to undertake it that very night, as being a man of great renown, who bore a charmed life, and was proof against unholy spells. John received this communication with much composure, and said, in a few words, that it would have afforded him inexpressible pleasure to do the Kingston people so slight a service, if it were not for his unfortunate propensity to fall asleep, which no man regretted more than himself upon the present occasion, but which quite settled the question. Nevertheless, he said, there was a gentleman present, and here he looked very hard at a tall farrier, who, having been engaged all his life in the manufacture of horseshoes, must be quite invulnerable to the power of witches, and who, he had no doubt, from his own reputation for bravery and good nature, would readily accept the commission. The farrier politely thanked him for his good opinion, which it would always be his study to deserve, but added that, with regard to the present little matter, he couldn't think of it on any account, as his departing on such an errand would certainly occasion the instant death of his wife, to whom, as they all knew, he was tenderly attached. Now, so far from this circumstance being notorious, everybody had suspected the reverse, as the farrier was in the habit of beating his lady rather more than tender husbands usually do. All the married men present, however, applauded his resolution with great vehemence, and one and all declared that they would stop at home and die if needful (which happily it was not) in defence of their lawful partners. This burst of enthusiasm over, they began to look, as by one consent, towards Will Marks, who, with his cap more on one side than ever, sat watching the proceedings with extraordinary unconcern. He had never been heard openly to express his disbelief in witches, but had often cut such jokes at their expense as left it to be inferred, publicly stating on several occasions that he considered a broomstick an inconvenient charger, and one especially unsuited to the dignity of the female character, and indulging in other free remarks of the same tendency, to the great amusement of his wild companions. As they looked at Will, they began to whisper and murmur among themselves, and at length one man cried, "Why don't you ask Will Marks?" As this was what everybody had been thinking of, they all took up the word, and cried in concert, "Ah! Why don't you ask Will?" "He don't care," said the farrier. "Not he," added another voice in the crowd. "He don't believe in it, you know," sneered a little man with a yellow face and a taunting nose and chin, which he thrust out from under the arm of a long man before him. "Besides," said a red-faced gentleman with a gruff voice, "he's a single man." "That's the point," said the farrier, and all the married men murmured, "Ah, that was it," and they only wished that they were single themselves. They would show him what spirit was, very soon. The messenger looked towards Will Marks beseechingly. "It will be a wet night, friend, and my grey nag is tired after yesterday's work." Here there was a general titter. "But," resumed Will, looking about him with a smile, "if nobody else puts in a better claim to go, for the credit of the town I am your man, and I would be if I had to go afoot. In 5 minutes I shall be in the saddle, unless I am depriving any worthy gentleman here of the honour of the adventure, which I wouldn't do for the world." But here arose a double difficulty, for not only did John Podgers combat the resolution with all the words he had, which were not many, but the young lady combated it too, with all the tears she had, which were very many indeed. Will, however, being inflexible, parried his uncle's objections with a joke, and coaxed the young lady into a smile in 3 short whispers. As it was plain that he set his mind upon it and would go, John Podgers offered him a few first-rate charms out of his own pocket, which he dutifully declined to accept, and the young lady gave him a kiss, which he also returned. "You see what a rare thing it is to be married," said Will, "and how careful and considerate all these husbands are. There's not a man among them but has his heart in leaping to forestall me in this adventure, and yet a strong sense of duty keeps him back. The husbands in this one little town are a pattern to the world, and so must the wives be too, for that matter, or they could never boast half the influence they have." Waiting for no reply to this sarcasm, he snapped his finger and withdrew into the house, and thence into the stable, while some busied themselves in refreshing the messenger, and others in baiting his steed. In less than the specified time he returned by another way, with a good cloak hanging over his arm, a good sword girded by his side, and leading his good horse caparisoned for the journey. "Now," said Will, leaping into the saddle at a bound, "up and away! Upon your mettle, friend, and push on! Good night!" He kissed his hand to the girl, nodded to his drowsy uncle, waved his cap to the rest, and off they flew pell-mell, as if all the witches in England were in their horses' legs. They were out of sight in a minute. The men who were left behind shook their heads doubtfully, stroking their chins, and shook their heads again. The farrier said that certainly Will Marks was a good horseman, nobody should ever say he denied that, but he was rash, very rash, and there was no telling what the end of it might be. What did he go for? That was what he wanted to know. He wished the young fellow no harm, but why did he go? Everybody echoed these words, and shook their heads again, having done which they wished John Podgers good night, and straggled home to bed. The Kingston people were in their first sleep when Will Marks and his conductor rode through the town, and up to the door of a house where sundry grave functionaries were assembled, anxiously expecting the arrival of the renowned Podgers. They were a little disappointed to find a gay young man in his place, but they put the best face upon the matter, and gave him full instructions how he was to conceal himself behind the gibbet, and watch and listen to the witches, and how at a certain time he was to burst forth and cut and slash among them vigorously, so that the suspected parties might be found bleeding in their beds next day, and thoroughly confounded. They gave him a great quantity of wholesome advice besides, and, which was more to the purpose with Will, a good supper. All these things being done, and midnight nearly come, they sallied forth to show him the spot where he was to keep his dreary vigil. The night was by this time dark and threatening. There was a rumble of distant thunder, and a low sighing of wind among the trees which was very dismal. The potentates of the town kept so uncommonly close to Will, that they trod upon his toes, or stumbled against his ankles, or nearly tripped up his heels at every step he took; and besides these annoyances, their teeth chattered so with fear, that he seemed to be accompanied by a dirge of castanets. At last they made a halt at the opening of a lonely, desolate space, and pointing to a black object at some distance, asked Will if he saw that yonder. Yes, he replied. What then? Informing him abruptly that it was the gibbet where he was to watch, they wished him good night in an extremely friendly manner, and ran back as fast as their feet would carry them. Will walked boldly to the gibbet, and glancing upwards when he came under it, saw, certainly with satisfaction, that it was empty, and that nothing dangled from the top but some iron chains, which swung mournfully to and fro as they were moved by the breeze. After a careful survey of every quarter, he determined to take his station with his face towards the town, both because that would place him with his back to the wind, and because if any trick or surprise were attempted, it would probably come from that direction in the first instance. Having taken these precautions, he wrapped his cloak about him so that it left the handle of his sword free and ready to his hand, and leaning against the gallows tree, with his cap not quite so much on one side as it had been before, took up his position for the night. Section 4. Master Humphrey's Clock. Section 5. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock by Charles Dickens. Section 5. Chapter 3, Part 2. Second chapter of Mr. Pickwick's Tale. We left Will Marks leaning under the gibbet with his face towards the town, scanning the distance with a keen eye which sought to pierce the darkness and catch the earliest glimpse of any person or persons that might approach towards him. But all was quiet, and save the howling of the wind as it swept across the heath in gusts, and the creaking of the chains that dangled above his head, there was no sound to break the sullen stillness of the night. After half an hour or so, this monotony became more disconcerting to Will than the most furious uproar would have been, and he heartily wished for some one antagonist with whom he might have a fair stand-up fight, if it were only to warm himself. Truth to tell, it was a bitter wind, and seemed to blow to the very heart of a man whose blood, heated but now with rapid riding, was the more sensitive to the chilling blasts. Will was a daring fellow, and cared not a jot for hard knocks or sharp blades, but he could not persuade himself to move or walk about, having just that vague expectation of a sudden assault which made it a comfortable thing to have something at his back, even though that something were a gallows tree. He had no great faith in the superstitions of the age, still such of them as occurred to him did not serve to lighten the time, or to render his situation the more endurable. He remembered how witches were said to repair at that ghostly hour to churchyards and gibbets, and such like dismal spots, to pluck the bleeding mandrake or scrape the flesh from dead men's bones, as choice ingredients for their spells; how, stealing by night to lonely places, they dug graves with their finger nails, or anointed themselves before riding in the air with a delicate pomatum made of the fat of infants newly boiled. These and many other fabled practices of a no less agreeable nature, and all having some reference to the circumstances in which he was placed, passed and repassed in quick succession through the mind of Will Marks, and adding a shadowy dread to that distrust and watchfulness which his situation inspired, rendered it upon the whole sufficiently uncomfortable. As he had foreseen, too, the rain began to descend heavily, and driving before the wind in a thick mist obscured even those few objects which the darkness of the night had before imperfectly revealed. 'Look!' shrieked a voice. 'Great Heaven, it has fallen down, and stands erect as if it lived!' The speaker was close behind him. The voice was almost at his ear. Will threw off his cloak, drew his sword, and darting swiftly round, seized a woman by the wrist, who, recoiling from him with a dreadful shriek, fell struggling upon her knees. Another woman, clad like her whom he had grasped, in mourning garments, stood rooted to the spot on which they were, gazing upon his face with wild and glaring eyes that quite appalled him. 'Say,' cried Will, when they had confronted each other thus for some time, 'what are ye?' 'Say, what are you,' returned the woman, 'who trouble even this obscene resting place of the dead, and strip the gibbet of its honoured burden? Where is the body?' He looked in wonder and affright from the woman who questioned him to the other whose arm he clutched. 'Where is the body?' repeated the questioner more firmly than before. 'You wear no livery which marks you for the hireling of the government. You are no friend to us, or I should recognise you, for the friends of such as we are few in number. What are you then, and wherefore are you here?' 'I am no foe to the distressed and helpless,' said Will. 'Are ye among that number? Ye should be, by your looks.' 'We are,' was the answer. 'Is it ye who have been wailing and weeping here under cover of the night?' said Will. 'It is,' replied the woman sternly, and pointing as she spoke towards her companion. 'She mourns a husband, and I a brother. Even the bloody law that wreaks its vengeance on the dead does not make that a crime, and if it did, 'twould be alike to us who are past its fear or favour.' Will glanced at the two females, and could barely discern that the one whom he addressed was much the elder, and that the other was young and of a slight figure. Both were deadly pale, their garments wet and worn, their hair dishevelled and streaming in the wind, themselves bowed down with grief and misery, their whole appearance most dejected, wretched, and forlorn. A sight so different from any he had expected to encounter touched him to the quick, and all idea of anything but their pitiable condition vanished before it. 'I am a rough, blunt yeoman,' said Will. 'Why I come here, is told in a word. You have been overheard at a distance in the silence of the night, and I have taken a watch for hags and spirits. I came here expecting an adventure, and prepared to go through with any. If there be aught that I can do to help or aid you, name it, and on the faith of a man who can be secret and trusty, I will stand by you to the death.' 'How comes this gibbet to be empty?' asked the elder female. 'I swear to you,' replied Will, 'that I know as little as yourself. But this I know, that when I came here an hour ago or so, it was as it is now; and if, as I gathered from your question, it was not so last night, sure I am that it has been secretly disturbed without the knowledge of the folks in yonder town. Bethink you, therefore, whether you have no friends in league with you, or with him on whom the law has done its worst, by whom these sad remains have been removed for burial.' The women spoke together, and Will retired a pace or two while they conversed apart. He could hear them sob and moan, and saw that they wrung their hands in fruitless agony. He could make out little that they said, but between whiles he gathered enough to assure him that his suggestion was not very wide of the mark, and that they not only suspected by whom the body had been removed, but also whither it had been conveyed. When they had been in conversation a long time, they turned towards him once more. This time the younger female spoke. 'You have offered us your help?' 'I have.' 'And given a pledge that you are still willing to redeem?' 'Yes, so far as I may, keeping all plots and conspiracies at arm's length.' 'Follow us, friend.' Will, whose self possession was now restored, needed no second bidding. But with his drawn sword in his hand, and his cloak so muffled over his left arm as to serve for a kind of shield without offering any impediment to its free action, suffered them to lead the way. Through mud and mire, and wind and rain, they walked in silence a full mile. At length they turned into a dark lane, where suddenly starting out from beneath some trees where he had taken shelter, a man appeared, having in his charge 3 saddled horses. One of these, his own apparently, in obedience to a whisper from the women, he consigned to Will, who, seeing that they mounted also. Then, without a word spoken, they rode on together, leaving the attendant behind. They made no halt, nor slackened their pace until they arrived near Putney. At a large wooden house which stood apart from any other they alighted, and giving their horses to one who was already waiting, passed in by a side door, and so up some narrow creaking stairs into a small panelled chamber, where Will was left alone. He had not been here very long when the door was softly opened, and there entered to him a cavalier, whose face was concealed beneath a black mask. Will stood upon his guard and scrutinized this figure from head to foot. The form was that of a man pretty far advanced in life, but of a firm and stately carriage. His dress was of a rich and costly kind, but so soiled and disordered that it was scarcely to be recognized for one of those gorgeous suits which the expensive taste and fashion of the time prescribed from men of any rank or station. He was booted and spurred, and bore about him even as many tokens of the state of the roads as Will himself. All this he noted, while the eyes behind the mask regarded him with equal attention. This survey over, the cavalier broke silence. 'Thou'rt young and bold, and would be richer than thou art?' 'The two first I am,' returned Will. 'The last I have scarcely thought of. But be it so. Say that I would be richer than I am. What then?' 'The way lies before thee now,' replied the Mask. 'Show it me.' 'First, let me inform thee that thou wert brought here to night lest thou shouldst too soon have told thy tale to those who placed thee in the watch.' 'I thought as much when I followed,' said Will, 'but I am no blab, not I.' 'Good,' returned the Mask. 'Now listen. He who was to have executed the enterprise of burying the body, which, as thou suspected, was taken down to night, has left us in our need.' Will nodded, and thought within himself that if the Mask were to attempt to play any tricks, the first eyelet hole on the left side of the doublet, counting from the buttons up the front, would be a very good place in which to pink him neatly. 'Thou art here, and the emergency is desperate. I propose his task to thee. Convey the body, now coffined in this house, by means that I shall show, to the church of St Dunstan in London to morrow night, and thy service shall be richly paid. Thou'rt about to ask whose corpse it is. Seek not to know. I warn thee, seek not to know. Felons hang in chains on every moor and heath. Believe, as others do, that this was one, and ask no further. The murders of state policy, its victims or avengers, had best remain unknown to such as thee.' 'The mystery of this service,' said Will, 'bespeaks its danger. What is the reward?' 100 golden unities,' replied the cavalier. 'The danger to one who cannot be recognised as the friend of a fallen cause is not great, but there is some hazard to be run. Decide between that and the reward.' 'What if I refuse?' said Will. 'Depart in peace, in God's name,' returned the Mask in a melancholy tone, 'and keep our secret, remembering that those who brought thee here were crushed and stricken women, and that those who bade thee go free could have had thy life with one word, and no man the wiser.' Men were readier to undertake desperate adventures in those times than they are now. In this case the temptation was great, and the punishment, even in case of detection, was not likely to be very severe, as Will came of a loyal stock, and his uncle was in good repute, and a passable tale, to account for his possession of the body and his ignorance of the identity, might be easily devised. The cavalier explained that a coveted cart had been prepared for the purpose; that the time of departure could be arranged so that he should reach London Bridge at dusk, and proceed through the city after the day had closed in; that people would be ready at his journey's end to place the coffin in a vault without a minute's delay; that officious inquiries into the streets would be easily repelled by the tale that he was carrying for interment the corpse of one who had died of the plague; and, in short, showed him every reason why he should succeed, and none why he should fail. After a time they were joined by another gentleman, masked like the first, who added new arguments to those which had been already urged. The wretched wife, too, added her tears and prayers to their calmer representations, and in the end, Will, moved by compassion and good nature, by a love of the marvellous, by a mischievous anticipation of the terrors of the Kingston people when he should be missing next day, and finally by the prospect of gain, took upon himself the task, and devoted all his energies to its successful execution. The following night, when it was quite dark, the hollow echoes of old London Bridge responded to the rumbling of the cart which contained the ghastly load, the object of Will Marks' care. Sufficiently disguised to attract no attention by his garb, Will walked at the horse's head, as unconcerned as a man could be who was sensible that he had now arrived at the most dangerous part of his undertaking, but full of boldness and confidence. It was now 8 o'clock. After 9, none could walk the streets without danger of their lives, and even at this hour robberies and murder were of no uncommon occurrence. The shops upon the bridge were all closed; the lone wooden arches thrown across the way were like so many black pits, in every one of which ill favoured fellows lurked in knots of 3 or 4, some standing upright against the wall lying in wait, others skulking in gateways and thrusting out their uncombed heads and scowling eyes, others crossing and recrossing, and constantly jostling both horse and man to provoke a quarrel, others stealing away and summoning their companions in a low whistle. Once, even in that short passage, there was the noise of scuffling and the clash of swords behind him, but Will, who knew the city and its ways, kept straight on, and scarcely turned his head. The streets being unpaved, the rain of the night before had converted them into a perfect quagmire, which the splashing waterspouts from the gables, and the filth and offal cast from the different houses, swelled in no small degree. These odious matters, being left to putrefy the close and heavy air, emitted an insupportable stench, to which every court and passage poured forth a contribution of its own. Many parts, even of the main streets, with their projecting stories tottering overhead, and nearly shutting out the sky, were more like huge chimneys than open ways. At the corners of some of these, great bonfires were burning to prevent infection from the plague, of which it was rumoured that some citizens had lately died, and few who, availing themselves of the light thus afforded, paused for a moment to look around them, would have been disposed to doubt the existence of the disease, or wonder at its dreadful visitations. But it was not in such scenes as these, or even in the deep and miry road, that Will Marks found the chief obstacles to his progress. There were kites and ravens feeding in the streets, the only scavengers the city kept, who, scenting what he carried, followed the cart or fluttered on its top, and croaked their knowledge of its burden and their ravenous appetite for prey. There were distant fires where the poor wood and plaster tenements wasted fiercely, and whither crowds made their way, clamouring eagerly for plunder, beating down all who came within their reach, and yelling like devils let loose. There were single-handed men flying from bands of ruffians, who pursued them with naked weapons, and hunted them savagely. There were drunken, desperate robbers, issuing from their dens and staggering through the open streets where no man dared molest them. There were vagabond servitors returned from the beer garden, which had been good sport that day, dragging after them their torn and bleeding dogs, or leaving them to die and rot upon the road. Nothing was abroad but cruelty, violence, and disorder. Many were the interruptions which Will Marks encountered from these stragglers, and many the narrow escapes he made. Now some stout bully would take his seat upon the cart, insisting to be driven to his own home, and now two or three men would come down upon him together, and demand that on peril of his life he showed them what he had inside. Then a party of the city watch upon their rounds would draw across the road, and not satisfied with his tale, question him closely, and revenge themselves by a little cuffing and hustling for maltreatment sustained at other hands that night. All these assailants had to be rebutted, some by fair words, some by foul, and some by blows, but Will Marks was not the man to be stopped or turned back now he had penetrated so far, and though he got on slowly, still he made his way down Fleet Street, and reached the church at last. As he had been forewarned, all was in readiness. Directly he stopped, the coffin was removed by four men, who appeared so suddenly that they seemed to have started from the earth. A fifth mounted the cart, and scarcely allowing Will time to snatch from it a little bundle containing such of his own clothes as he had thrown off on assuming his disguise, drove briskly away. Will never saw cart or man again. He followed the body into the church, and it was well he lost no time in doing so, for the door was immediately closed. There was no light in the building save that which had come from a couple of torches borne by two men in cloaks, which stood upon the brink of a vault. Each supported a female figure, and all observed a profound silence. By this dim and solemn glare, which made Will feel as though light itself were dead, and its tomb the dreary arches that frowned above, they placed the coffin in the vault with uncovered heads, and closed it up. One of the torch bearers then turned to Will, and stretched forth his hand, in which was a purse of gold. Something told him directly that those were the same eyes which he had seen beneath the mask. 'Take it,' said the cavalier in a low voice, 'and be happy. Though these have been hasty obsequies, and no priest had blessed the work, there will not be the least peace with thee thereafter for having laid his bones beside those of his little children. Keep thy own counsel, for thy sake no less than ours, and God be with thee.' 'The blessing of a widowed mother on thy head, good friend!' cried the younger lady through her tears. 'The blessing of one who has now no hope or rest but in this grave!' Will stood with the purse in his hand, and involuntarily made a gesture as though he would return it, for though a thoughtless fellow, he was of a frank and generous nature. But the two gentlemen, extinguishing their torches, cautioned him to be gone, as their common safety would be endangered by a longer delay, and at the same time their retreating footsteps sounded through the church. He turned, therefore, towards the point at which he had entered, and seeing by a faint gleam in the distance that the door was again partially open, groped his way towards it and so passed into the street. Meantime the local authorities of Kingston had kept watch and ward all the previous night, fancying every now and then that dismal shrieks were borne to them on the wind, and frequently winking to each other and drawing closer to the fire as they drank the health of the lonely sentinel, upon whom a clerical gentleman present was especially severe by reason of his levity and youthful folly. Two or three of the gravest in company, who were of a theological turn, propounded to him the question whether such a character was not but poorly armed for single combat with the devil, and whether he himself would not have been a stronger opponent; but the clerical gentleman, sharply reproving them for their presumption in discussing such questions, clearly showed that a fitter companion than Will could scarcely have been selected, not only for that being a child of Satan he was the less likely to be alarmed by the appearance of his own father, but because Satan himself would be at his ease in such company, and would not scruple to kick up his heels to an extent which it was quite certain he would never venture before clerical eyes, under whose influence, as was notorious, he became quite a tame and milk and water character. But when next morning arrived, and with it no Will Marks, and when a strong party, repairing to the spot as a strong party ventured to do in broad day, found Will gone and the gibbet empty, matters grew serious indeed. The day passing away and no news arriving, and the night going on also without any intelligence, the thing grew more tremendous still. In short, the neighbourhood worked itself up to such a comfortable pitch of mystery and horror, that it is a great question whether the general feeling was not one of excessive disappointment, when, on the second morning, Will Marks returned. However this may be, back Will came in a very cool and collected state, and appearing not to trouble himself much about anybody except old John Podgers, who, having been sent for, was sitting in the town hall crying slowly, and dozing between whiles. Having embraced his uncle and assured him of his safety, Will mounted on a table and told his story to the crowd. And surely they would have been the most unreasonable crowd that ever assembled together, if they had been in the least respect disappointed with the tale he told them. For besides describing the witches' dance to the minutest motion of their legs, and performing it in character on the table, with the assistance of a broomstick, he related how they had carried off the body in a copper cauldron, and so bewitched him that he lost his senses until he found himself lying under a hedge at least 10 miles off, whence he had straightway returned, as they then beheld. The story gained such universal applause, that it soon afterwards brought down express from London the great witch finder of the age, the heaven born Hopkins, who, having examined Will closely on several points, pronounced it the most extraordinary and the best accredited witch story ever known, under which title it was published at the Three Bibles on London Bridge, in small quarto, with a view of the cauldron, from an original drawing and a portrait of the clerical gentleman as he sat by the fire. On one point Will was particularly careful, and that was to describe for the witches he had seen, 3 impossible old females, whose likenesses never were or never will be. Thus he saved the lives of the suspected parties, and of all other old women who were dragged before him to be identified. This circumstance occasioned John Podgers much grief and sorrow, until happening one day to cast his eyes upon his housekeeper, and observing her to be plainly afflicted with rheumatism, he procured her to be burnt as an undoubted witch. For this service to the state he was immediately knighted, and became from that time Sir John Podgers. Will Marks never gained any clue to the mystery in which he had been an actor, nor did any inscription in the church which he often visited afterwards, nor any of the limited inquiries that he dared to make, yield him the least assistance. As he kept his own secret, he was compelled to spend the gold discreetly and sparingly. In the course of time he married the young lady of whom I have already told you, whose maiden name is not recorded, with whom he led a prosperous and happy life. Years and years after this adventure, it was his wont to tell her, upon a stormy night, that it was a great comfort to him to think those bones, to whomsoever they might have once belonged, were not bleaching in the troubled air, but were mouldering away with the dust of their own kith and kindred in a quiet grave. Further particulars of Master Humphrey's visitor. Being very full of Mr. Pickwick's application, and highly pleased with the compliment he had paid me, it will be readily supposed that long before our next night of meeting I communicated it to my three friends, who unanimously voted his admission into our body. We all looked forward with some impatience to the occasion which would enroll him among us, but I am greatly mistaken if Jack Redburn and myself were not by many degrees the most impatient of the party. At length the night came, and a few minutes after 10 Mr. Pickwick's knock was heard at the street door. He was shown into a lower room, and I directly took my crooked stick and went to accompany him upstairs, in order that he might be presented with all honour and formality. "Mr. Pickwick," said I, on entering the room, "I am rejoiced to see you, rejoiced to believe that this is but the opening of a long series of visits to this house, and but the beginning of a close and lasting friendship." The gentleman made a suitable reply, with a cordiality and frankness peculiarly his own, and glanced with a smile towards two persons behind the door whom I had not at first observed, and whom I immediately recognised as Mr. Samuel Weller and his father. It was a warm evening, but the elder Mr. Weller was attired, notwithstanding, in a most capricious greatcoat, and his chin enveloped in a large speckled shawl, such as is usually worn by stage coachmen on active service. He looked very rosy and very stout, especially about the legs, which appeared to have been compressed into his top boots with some difficulty. His broad-brimmed hat he held under his left arm, and with the forefinger of his right hand he touched his forehead a great many times in acknowledgment of my presence. "I am very glad to see you in such good health, Mr. Weller," said I. "I thankee, sir," returned Mr. Weller. "The axle ain't broke yet. We keeps up a steady pace, not too severe, but with a moderate degree of friction, and the consequence is that ve're still a running and comes in to the time regular. My son Samivel, sir, as you may have read on in history," added Mr. Weller, introducing his firstborn. I received Sam very graciously, but before he could say a word his father struck in again. "Samivel Veller, sir," said the old gentleman, "has conferred upon me the ancient title of grandfather, which had been long laid dormouse, and was supposed to be nearly hextinct in our family. Sammy, relate an anecdote of one of them boys, that 'ere little anecdote about young Tony's saying as he would smoke a pipe unbeknown to his mother." "Be quiet, can't you?" said Sam. "I never see such a old magpie, never." "That 'ere Tony's the blessedest boy," said Mr. Weller, heedless of this rebuff, "the blessedest boy as I ever see in my days. Of all the charmin'est infants as ever I heard tell on, includin' them as was kivered over by the robin redbreasts arter they committed suicide with blackberries, there never was any like that 'ere little Tony. He's always a playin' with a quart pot, that boy is. To see him a settin' down on the doorstep pretendin' to drink out of it, and fetchin' a long breath artervards, and smokin' a bit of firevood, and sayin', 'Now I'm grandfather.' To see him a doin' that at 2 year old is better than any play as was ever wrote. 'Now I'm grandfather.' He wouldn't take a pint pot if you was to make him a present on it, but he gets his quart, and then he says, 'Now I'm grandfather.'" Mr. Weller was so overpowered by this picture that he straightway fell into a most alarming fit of coughing, which must certainly have attended with some fatal result, but for the dexterity and promptitude of Sam, who, taking a firm grasp of the shawl just under his father's chin, shook him to and fro with great violence, at the same time administering some short blows between his shoulders. By this curious mode of treatment Mr. Weller was finally recovered, but with a very crimson face and in a state of great exhaustion. "He'll do now, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, who had been in some alarm himself. "He'll do, sir!" cried Sam, looking reproachfully at his parent. "Yes, he will do, one of these days. He'll do for hisself, and then he'll wish he hadn't. Didn't anybody ever see such an inconsiderate old file? Laughing into conwulsions afore company, and stamping on the floor as if he'd brought his own carpet vith him and was under a wager to punch the pattern out in a given time. He'll begin again in a minute. There! He's a going off. I said he would." In fact, Mr. Weller, whose mind was still running upon his precocious grandson, was seen to shake his head from side to side, while a laugh, working like an earthquake below the surface, produced various extraordinary appearances in his face, chest, and shoulders, the more alarming because unaccompanied by any noise whatever. These emotions, however, gradually subsided, and after 3 or 4 short relapses he wiped his eyes with the cuff of his coat, and looked about him with tolerable composure. "Afore the governor withdraws," said Mr. Weller, "there is a pint respectin' which Sammy has a question to ask. While that question is a perwadin', this here conwersation, p'raps the gen'lm'n will permit me to retire." "Wot are you going away for?" demanded Sam, seizing his father by the coat tail. "I never see such an undootiful boy as you, Samivel," returned Mr. Weller. "Didn't you make a solemn promise, amountin' almost to his speeches awhile, that you'd put that 'ere question on my account?" "Well, I'm agreeable to it," said Sam, "but not if you go cuttin' away like that, as the bull turned round and mildly observed to the drover when they was a goadin' him into the butcher's door." "The fact is, sir," said Sam, addressing me, "that he wants to know somethin' respectin' that 'ere lady as is housekeeper here." "Ay, what is that?" "Why, sir," said Sam, grinning still more, "he wishes to know vether she—" "In short," interposed old Mr. Weller decisively, a perspiration breaking out upon his forehead, "vether that 'ere old creetur is or is not a widder." Mr. Pickwick laughed heartily, and so did I, as I replied decisively that my housekeeper was a spinster. "There!" cried Sam, "now you're satisfied. You hear she's a spinster." "A wot?" said his father, with deep scorn. "A spinster," replied Sam. Mr. Weller looked very hard at his son for a minute or two, and then said, "Never mind vether she makes jokes or not, that's no matter. Wot I say is that 'ere female a widder, or is she not?" "What do you mean by her making jokes?" demanded Sam, quite aghast at the obscurity of his parent's speech. "Never you mind, Samivel," returned Mr. Weller gravely. "Puns may be wery good things or they may be wery bad ones, and a female may be none the better or she may be none the vorse for making of 'em. That's got nothin' to do with widders." "Why now," said Sam, looking round, "would anybody believe as a man at his time o' life could be running his head against spinsters and punsters being the same thing?" "There ain't a straw's difference between 'em," said Mr. Weller. "Your father didn't drive a coach for so many years not to be equal to his own langvidge as far as that goes, Sammy." Avoiding the question of etymology, upon which the old gentleman's mind was quite made up, he was several times assured that the housekeeper had never been married. He expressed great satisfaction on hearing this, and apologised for the question, remarking that he had been greatly terrified by a widow not long before, and that his natural timidity was increased in consequence. "It was on the rail," said Mr. Weller, with strong emphasis. "I was a goin' down to Birmingham by the rail, and I was locked up in a close carriage vith a living widder. Alone we was, the widder and me was alone, and I believe it was only because we was alone and there was no clergyman in the conweyance, that that 'ere widder didn't marry me afore we reached the half way station. Ven I think how she began a screamin' as we was goin' under them tunnels in the dark, how she kept on a faintin' and catchin' hold o' me, and how I tried to bust open the door as was tight locked and perwented all escape, ah, it was an awful thing, most awful." Mr. Weller was so very much overcome by this retrospect that he was unable, until he had wiped his brow several times, to return any reply to the question whether he approved of railway communication, notwithstanding that it would appear from the answer which he ultimately gave, that he entertained strong opinions on the subject. "I consider," said Mr. Weller, "that the rail is unconstitootional and an inwaser o' priwileges, and I should wery much like to know wot that 'ere old Carter as once stood up for our liberties and won 'em too, I should like to know wot he vould say if he was alive now, to Englishmen being locked up with widders or with anybody against their wills. What an old Carter would have said that an old coachman may say (and I assert that in that point of view alone the rail is an inwaser), as to the comfort
Vere's the comfort o' sittin' in a harm chair looking at brick walls or heaps o' mud, never comin' to a public house, never seein' a glass o' ale, never goin' through a pike, never meetin' a change o' no kind, horses or othervise, but alvays comin' to a place ven you come to one at all, the wery pictur o' the last, with the wery same pleecemen standin' about, the same blessed old bell a ringin', the same unfortunate people standin' behind the bars a waitin' to be let in, and everythin' the same except the name, vich is wrote up in the same sized letters as the last name and vith the same colours. As to the honour and dignity o' travellin', vere can that be vithout a coachman, and what's the rail to such coachmen and guards as is sometimes forced to go by it by an outrage and an insult? As to the pace, what sort o' pace d'ye think I, Tony Veller, could have kept a coach goin' at for £500,000 a mile paid in adwance after the coach was on the road? And as to the engine, a nasty wheezin', creakin', gaspin', puffin', bustin' monster, always out o' breath, with a shiny green and gold back, like an unpleasant beetle in that 'ere gas magnifier, as to the engine as is always a pourin' out red hot coals at night and black smoke in the day, the sensiblest thing it does, in my opinion, is ven there's somethin' in the vay, and it sets up that 'ere frightful scream which seems to say, "Now here's 240 passengers in the wery greatest extremity o' danger, and here's their 240 screams in vun." By this time I began to fear that my friends would be rendered impatient by my protracted absence. I therefore begged Mr. Pickwick to accompany me upstairs, and left the two Mr. Wellers in the care of the housekeeper, laying strict injunctions upon her to treat them with all possible hospitality. Section 6